Guided selling from RingDNA makes your entire sales team more effective by revealing exactly what reps should do and when to do it. Guided selling works by transforming sales data into a curated list of prioritized sales actions. So when reps start their day, they'll never again wonder which prospects and accounts or hot inbound leads to reach out to next. Guided selling even shifts reps' priority in response to real-time buying signals. Finally, even new reps can sell like seasoned ones. Let RingDNA be your guide to success. Learn more at ringdna.com/guided selling. That's ringdna.com/guided selling.
I think that there is so much of how we're programmed and how we think about the world. We're like, yes, growth mindset. I believe I can change and grow. And yet when we start to analyze what we say to ourselves, what we say to other people, I mean, it's a simple example. I've said on numerous occasions, I'm a very serious person. And in the moment when I say that, I have now labeled myself and I have closed the door on my ability to be not serious, to be fun-loving, to be joyful, to laugh at things, and not even realizing I'm doing it.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. Now, that was Whitney Johnson, and Whitney's the author of the book titled Disrupt Yourself, Master Relentless Change, and Speed Up Your Learning Curve. Now, right off the bat, let me tell you, I love this book. If you're in sales in any capacity and you're struggling to improve your performance and you perhaps need some additional motivation to make a change, then you need to read Whitney's book. Now, Whitney and I cover a lot of ground in this conversation. First of all, she explains how the S-curve of innovative disruption that was first popularized in the late Clayton Christensen's famous book, The Innovator's Dilemma, how you can apply that S-curve to your own personal disruption, your own personal transformation, if you will. We also dig into the psychology and neuroscience related to personal transformation and the factors that drive your motivation to learn. And we also talk about why some people feel it's a big risk to invest in their own development, which is sort of interesting. They feel it's a risk to disrupt themselves. Well, we'll get into all that and much, much more. Definitely listen to the end today. Now, before we get to Whitney, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it. And if you subscribe, we'd certainly appreciate it if you could give us your feedback about how we're doing in the form of a review. So thank you. And if you haven't already connected with me on LinkedIn, that's linkedin.com/in/realandypaul. Look forward to it. All right, let's jump into it. Whitney, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Andy. I am delighted to be here.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you because I liked your book a lot. So, I know you didn't write it for a sales audience per se, but there's a lot of very sales specific stuff in there. I thought, at least maybe the lens I read it, so I can't wait to chat with you about it. But one thing I wanted to ask first, hopefully you're well. We're recording this in the midst of the lockdown, so I didn't want to omit the formalities, but everybody's healthy on your end?
We are well. Thank you for asking. I mean, it's one of those questions that it used to be just a nicety, but it's now a real question, isn't it?
It is a real question, right? Well, that's good. And you're joining us from where again?
We live in Lexington, Virginia. So my husband is a professor at Southern Virginia University, which is also near Virginia Military Institute and Washington and Lee. So we're about 3 hours driving southwest of Washington, D.C.
So is that like out near Roanoke then?
Yes. Okay. That's our closest airport. It's about 50 miles away.
Wow. Okay. So having lived in big cities, you're sort of doing a little more, not say rural, but smaller city living.
It's definitely rural. We completely disrupted ourselves. I mean, like if you look outside of our window in the morning, we can see deer and there are cows next door to us. In fact, when we very first moved here, because we've lived in Boston and Manhattan and large cities, and when we first moved here, I remember waking up one morning and I was hitting not hitting him, but pulling my honey, turn off your phone, because it was like buzzing. And he turned over and he's like, those are the cows mooing. So it has definitely been an adjustment for us.
Yeah. I mean, I find when I'm away from Manhattan, depending where I go, but like when I visit my sister in Wisconsin, and both my wife and I sort of get woken up by the quiet. It's like it's too quiet, and it's like, wait, why are we awake? Why are we awake? And you're so accustomed to having the noise outside all the time at some level that when it's too quiet, it keeps me up.
Oh, I love that. Woken up by the quiet.
So I was going to ask you, are you a fellow soccer fan? Because you wrote that you were going to produce a reality TV show about soccer in Latin America, and listeners to the show know that I'm an avid soccer fan.
Oh, I wish I could say that I am. I just got really excited. So this is actually, almost 15 years ago now, where I was a huge American Idol fan and a huge So You Think You Can Dance fan. And I was doing a lot of work in Latin America. I was an equity analyst. And so, I've been to Mexico 50 times. So spent a lot of my career doing work in Latin America. And one of our companies that we followed as an equity analyst was Televisa, which at the time was basically ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox combined. And again, this is 15 years ago. And so we thought, wait, we have an opportunity here to basically do, soccer meets American Idol, and just got so excited about the stories that could have produced. So while I'm not a soccer fan per se, I am a Cinderella story fan. And I just thought that could have been an amazing show to have produced.
Yeah, I would have watched it for sure. So yeah, regular listeners get accustomed to me going off on soccer stuff here. Tangents, everything relates to soccer. Soccer explains the world. There was a book that wrote that. So about that. So
I think I read that book, actually. It was a good book.
Yeah. So, and I had the author on the show. So, so we're going to talk about transformation, personal transformation. I've really enjoyed your book, which you've just, I guess, updated and re-released. Disrupt Yourself, Master Relentless Change, and Speed Up Your Learning Curve. So what was the original impetus to write the book?
That's one of those questions that you can answer it many different ways. But let me see if I can streamline so that we're not here all day long. I was as I just mentioned, I was an equity analyst working at Merrill Lynch in focusing on stocks in Latin America, like Televisa, like América Móvil. And this is back in like 2003, 2004. I read the book, The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School. And I remember reading that book, and it just was in many a transformative experience, if you will, because I was looking at wireless at the time, and every single quarter, América Móvil was beating my numbers, like just every time. And Telmex's numbers weren't. So that was the wireline company, and then América Móvil was the wireless. And I read The Innovator's Dilemma, and I said, oh, that's what's going on, is that wireless is disrupting wireline. And I was just fascinated that there was this theory that could explain to me the world and help me understand what was happening. But the more I read that book, the more I started, I think maybe just because of my own personal bent, started thinking, well, how does this apply to me? Like, I understand that this explains products and services and companies and countries, but I also remember having this moment. I think this was 2004, and I had just had this conversation with someone in management saying, I'd really like to try something else. I'd like to do something else internally. I'd like to go into management. And they kind of laughed at me, kind of snickered, like, oh, that's nice. That's never going to happen. And I remember coming back to that book and thinking, you know what? If I want to do whatever it is I think I'm meant to do, which I had a very vague notion, I think many of us do, I'm going to have to disrupt myself. I'm going to have to leave Wall Street and go do something else. And so the impetus for that book was really that aha that I had when I was still working on Wall Street and just starting to chase down that idea. What does it mean to disrupt yourself? And then I subsequently left. I disrupted myself. I left Wall Street. We were now living in Boston. I connected with Clayton Christensen, working on a bunch of volunteer projects with him. He wanted to start a fund, asked me if I would start that with him and his son. And so as I started to really get steeped in these frameworks of disruption and study at the feet of this giant of a man, I just started really thinking about this idea more and more, and eventually wrote an article in Harvard Business Review titled Disrupt Yourself, which then later became a book. The book,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we should mention that Clayton just passed away recently.
Yes, in January.
Yeah.
The world lost a really good man.
Yeah. That book also. I mean, I was quite taken by it when I first read it, which is quite a while ago. And I'm glad you sort of took it and put it into these personal terms, right? Instead of company examples, but human examples about it. Because I look at it from we're largely a sales audience on this show, but this idea of disrupting yourself is so fundamental, I think, to certainly sales, but I think perhaps every profession in these days, is that the landscape you're dealing with is always changing. Whether it's the internet or technology or your customers' behaviors being affected by those things I mentioned, or industries coming and going. And we really struggle in sales with the whole idea about how do people improve, right? And how do we help people perform at higher levels? And we just don't have a good model to look at that from, right? Is because I think that there's always, we go into it this assumption that people sort of fall into these various strata of from bad to good, the A players to the D players, the F players. When I really think that people really exist within, most people exist within a certain band. There might be some outliers on either end, but it's the steps they take themselves that move them out of that band to become that outlier or that top performer. And that basically everybody has that capability.
I completely agree. I mean, I think, it's interesting whenever we have this conversation, this kind of conversation that you and I are having, because it starts to go to a lot of a priori assumptions or fundamental assumptions that we have about the world and about people. And I think, someone like Carol Dweck in her book, Growth Mindset, I think has really opened up that conversation. But even so, I think that there is so much of how we're programmed and how we think about the world. We're like, yes, growth mindset. I believe I can change and grow. And yet when we start to analyze and, what we say to ourselves, what we say to other people, I mean, just for example, it's a simple example. I've said on numerous occasions, I'm a very serious person. And in the moment when I say that, I have now labeled myself and I have closed the door on my ability to be not serious, to be, fun loving, to be joyful, to laugh at things and not even realizing I'm doing it. And so even I think, as I'm talking about this and writing about it and thinking about it all day long, there's this notion or these a priori assumptions that we have where we're saying, yes, I believe I can change. Yes, I believe I can be different. Yes, I believe I can disrupt myself, but only in these certain parts of my life. There's these other parts of my life where I don't believe it. And so that's part of why I think these ideas and concepts are so powerful, because if we can start to apply them across the sort of the array of behaviors and of our life, then we start to really see some significant and meaningful change happen.
Well, I was thinking about this along those lines with the issue of how, okay, if everybody has the basic capabilities to succeed, let's say, or the vast majority of people do, and they exist in this band, the question becomes really, how do people become motivated to take that step to begin to disrupt themselves? And it seems like I don't know, as more I was thinking about, it's like, and even to the point you sort of mentioned about people saying, I can't change in these areas. In order to admit that they could change in those areas, they have to be willing to be vulnerable and admit that there's something about themselves or about some subject that they don't know.
Yeah,
and I always
absolutely.
feel like that's such the huge barrier, especially in the sales world, as we, without getting into a long conversation about how we structure sales, but like, managers, we because of the position they're in, we assume that they're experts on this broad array of topics, which most of them aren't. And as a consequence, they're not able to really help their people in the way they need to be able to help them grow. But in order for that change to start happening, is they'll have to admit that, there's something I don't know.
Right.
But they don't admit that to somebody that's paying them a lot of money because they assume they know that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, like, everybody's bought up and down the chain is bought into this fiction that keeps these inefficient structures in place.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, it's crazy. So let's talk about the S curve, because this is a concept that came from the Innovator's Dilemma, and you're employing this at a personal level. Was this as you were starting to work with Clayton Christensen, was it like an epiphany, where you sort of looked at it and said,
Yeah.
"Oh, wow! If
Yeah,
we did
it
this."
was. It was. So we were using so just for people who aren't familiar with it, it's something that was developed by E.M. Rogers in 1960, or I shouldn't say developed, popularized by E.M. Rogers in 1962, and he wrote a book called The Diffusion of Innovations, and it talks about how quickly an innovation will be adopted. And we, during COVID-19 have looked at that to track how quickly a virus will spread. And
Mm-hmm.
so we were using it at the Disruptive Innovation Fund to figure out, well, how quickly will an innovation be adopted? And therefore, does it make sense to buy the stock now or later? And so, as we were doing that, because I was already thinking that disruption applies to products and services and people, I think there was a natural sort of extension of that. And again, I come from the stock market. I was used to thinking about momentum. What makes a stock go up? What makes a stock go down? How do you drive that momentum? There was this notion for me of like, wait a second, I think this applies to people too. Like, how does this S curve apply to us? And so the big aha that I had was it could help us understand how we learn and how we grow. And so just at a very high level, if you can just in your brain right now kind of trace an S, it almost looks like a roller coaster, but you've got the base of that S. When you first start something, it's brand new and your growth is happening, but you can't see it. It's sort of like lily pads. It's happening, but it's not obvious. And so it feels like it's very slow. And this, it feels like a slog. And when you know that, it helps you avoid discouragement. And that's also happening with an innovation as well. Sort of first 10 to 15%, nothing's very obvious. But then you hit that knee of that curve and you move into the steep, sleek back of that S. And this is where you're in hypergrowth. And from a learning perspective, whereas at the launch point of that S curve, it took a lot of time for a little bit to happen. Now, in a little time, a lot happens. And so you know enough, but not too much. And it's hard, but not too hard. And it's exhilarating. This is where you feel like, this is where I'm supposed to be. Like, I am on the right S curve.
Right.
And then there's the top of that S where you start to say, you know what? I'm really good at my job. I'm hitting my quota every month. But there's a piece of you who says, I'm also a little bit bored. I'm starting to feel like I'm just dialing it in. And what's happening there is that, yes, growth is still happening, but it's happening at a decelerating pace. And so you're no longer learning. Your neurons, you're no longer getting the feel-good effects of dopamine. And so you start to experience that dilemma of personal disruption, which is, if I jump, there's going to be risk because it's kind of scary to jump and do something new. But if I don't jump, there's also risk. I could get toppled. I'll have other people selling more than I am because I'm not excited anymore about what I'm learning and how I'm growing and developing. What I will say, Andy, is I believe that every single person is on an S curve. All of us, including you, including your producer, Alec, like we're all on an S curve. And so then the question becomes is, how do we make sure that we get onto the right S curve? Because when we're on the right S curve, we are motivated to climb that S curve.
Okay, well, we'll get back to that. That's a great question. How do we know we're on the right S curve? I want people to sort of imagine, this S is not like an S I would write with my handwriting. It's as you said, it has sort of this steep curve in the middle, sort of S at the top and the bottom. It's just so people can sort of picture it in their minds. But it seems like there could be sort of false S curves as well. Because as I was reading through the book, I was sort of struck also by this whole idea of like the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Is that when people get a little bit of experience, they experience a little of that dopamine rush, they get this danger of sort of being self-satisfied. So they haven't hit the mastery part, but they've got that rush, and they think, oh, okay, I've got it, right? And then they stop learning, and so it's almost like you could be in the high growth part of the accelerated part of the growth curve, but slide backwards.
Yeah, such a great observation. And part of what can happen, and so if you think of, again, so you've got, so let's just trace it out for people. With your hand, go from left to right, flat. And then with your hand, now go sort of down to up with your hand, but sort of sweeping to the right. And then that's the steep part. And then use your right hand, to go from right to further right, sort of flattening out. So flat, steep, flat. And what you're talking about is when you go from being at the flat or the launch point into that steep part, you start growing really, really fast. You're in that engagement area. And as you said, You can just start to say, I did it. Here I am. I'm
Victory.
so
We declare
awesome.
victory. Mission accomplished.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a great salesperson. Look at, I hit my numbers this month. And so and we sometimes do see that in particular in markets that are very hot and there's a lot of demand for talent. And we'll use sales right now because that's who your audience is. There's a lot of demand. And so you start to think you're super awesome. And someone comes to you and dangles a lot of money and a lot of incentives at you. And then you jump to a brand new S curve and you start all over again. And so you barely get into engagement and then you jump and you do that over and over again. And when you do that, you actually arrest your development because there are things that you learn in the process of being in that sweet spot that are going to allow you that cycle of you learn and you leap and repeat. It's the completing of the cycle as many times as you possibly can that are going to allow you to fully develop as a professional and as a human being. And so, yes, you can have that sort of false sense and yes, you want to disrupt yourself, but there's also, you can also disrupt yourself too much.
Well, right. And this is a critical point for many people in this audience who are listening who, average tenure in a lot of sales jobs these days is sort of 12 to 18 months, and especially in some of the higher growth industries. And I see this repeatedly as, people make these quick jumps and they get to this point after the second or third jump. It's like, I really don't know any more than I did before.
That's right.
No more closer to mastery of this profession I'm in. And I relate back to my own experiences. I sort of did that earlier in my career as well, back when the job hopping of that nature first started years and years ago. And I was in one situation where I had the opportunity to leave after a couple of years. I said, no, I don't know why I told myself this. I said, I need to stay. And for me, that transformed my career. By staying instead of jumping, I got promoted in 2 or 3 different new jobs, incredible experience that I'd never have had. I took over international sales. I had no international experience. All these opportunities came because I stayed to keep on learning.
Yeah. I love that. I mean, there is that cycle that it's important to play that out. And I think actually that's where the Peter principle can come in, is that if you jump too many times, you're getting all these basically false starts. And so you're not learning anything. And then all of a sudden, and I think this sometimes happens, this is why people lose their jobs, is because they've kept climbing. They haven't learned anything. And so they kind of have to get pushed back and put in a place where they can learn something new and again complete that cycle of development that we're talking about.
You just triggered a thought. Isn't it about time for the Peter principle to come back?
I don't know.
No one ever refers to it, right? I mean, and it's not that you're dating yourself. Yeah, I know, but if I brought it up, I know I'd be dating myself. You're younger than I am, so that's fine. But it is a book that's, to your point, it still has relevance because the example you gave this, and you see it in sales. People jump too quickly. And not a few cases is they go these rapid jumps and then they get promoted into a management position. And it just compounds the issue because they don't have the mastery or the experience to be able to help the people that work for them. And that's it, just compounds the problem for everybody in that chain.
Right. And, as you're saying that, one of the thoughts that I'm having is if someone's listening right now and they're saying to themselves, well, I have this opportunity and I want to take it. What I would argue is like use this as a sort of a signal to you to go have a conversation with your manager. Because if you're feeling like you really want to jump, it's not just about the money. It's never just about the money. There's some element of you that's saying, I want to learn more. I want to stretch more. I want to be seen. And this is one of the challenges for a manager when you've got people in the sweet spot of that S, is if they're really good and everything's working, you tend to ignore them. You're focused on the people who are at the launch point of that S who don't know what they're doing, and you're trying to get them up to speed. And you focus the people who are at the high end because you're afraid that they're going to leave. So you start to ignore people who are in the sweet spot. And so what I would say is if you're like, I'm feeling like I want to go to your manager, go to your stakeholders and say, I love it here, but I need more training. I need more opportunities. I need to be seen. I need to be acknowledged, whatever it is, so that you can just play out that cycle. Even if it's another 6 to 12 months, usually it's symptomatic of something else. Because in my experience, it's not usually about the money.
Well, I agree. Well, one of the things that you just brought up, which is something that you talk about, go to your manager, say, I want more training and so on. But it seems like that in many respects, when I and again, I haven't done this rigorous academic study, but I look at the people I've worked with over my long career and people that have succeeded versus those that haven't, given what I think is sort of relative similar capabilities. It wasn't relying on the company to invest in them. They invested in themselves. This is, they took the responsibility as much as you invested in yourself, right? And disrupted what you were doing completely. This to me is one of the big hurdles for a lot of people, and talk specifically about sales, but I'm sure it exists in a lot of professions. But sales is perhaps more acute because it's such a performance-based profession. Is that the learning comes from, I think it's more experiential. It's things you do on your own more than anything you can learn in a company training program and so on. It's what are the things you're doing yourself, and what are the things you're reading to increase your acumen and other examples. But it's getting people to take that first step is really hard. And so you talk about in the book about if a task is both meaningful and relevant, right? And it seems like just maybe in general, we do a bad job of explaining that for people as to why they should be motivated to take and make these investments in themselves.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I got so excited about the S curve, in terms of thinking of it as an artifact for us to think about learning, is that it really does both of those jobs. And I do think that we need both, which is number one, for each of us to take responsibility for our own development and learning and be able to say, okay, now I get what this looks like. It's going to be slow, and then it's going to be fast, and then it's going to be slow. And when it starts to be slow, I need to figure out what I'm going to do next. It also, though, gives you a way to talk about it, a language that you can become fluent in, that you can have a conversation with your stakeholders as well. So that, as you're saying, I think it's time for me to jump to a new S curve or do something new along this S curve. You can have that conversation with your stakeholders, and you're speaking the same language, and basically say to them, I really love working for you, and I love working here, and I want to be here. I also know that I'm starting to get to the top of my S curve, and my utility to this organization will start to decrease. So here's what I think we can do about it. And are you open to that? And the thing that I think is so fascinating, Andy, and you tell me if this is true, I'm always fascinated by how people who are good at sales, and I really believe it is such an important skill, are amazing at selling externally, but struggle to sell internally. And maybe it goes back to the cobbler's children have no shoes, but taking those skills that you use every single day and being able to figure out how to sell your ideas, sell your jump to a new S curve internally. You're chuckling, so it sounds like you agree.
Well, no, I didn't. I never had that problem. I mean, that was I was always good selling internally. Sometimes too good. But worked for one company. I was running sales for the startup, and the CEO comes in. We were a mature company, but says, "You realize, I'm walking around this company, talking to everybody. Everybody says they're doing a project for you." He says, "You realize you don't set the tone for you're not setting the strategy for the company, don't you?" I was like, That's one of the things I was really good at is getting everybody, sold on supporting the stuff I was working on. But I agree. I think
I love it. I'm so impressed. No wonder you're running this podcast.
Yeah, but I mean, it's. I agree. I think it's. You're sort of really talking about self-advocacy, right, to some degree.
Yes.
And I think that people, again, it gets that point I talked earlier. You have to be vulnerable to advocate for yourself. And it's so funny is, one of the things that's increasingly come into the vernacular in sales is, well, if you want to build a connection with another human being and you want to start building trust, you have to be vulnerable, right? You have to reveal something of yourself in order to start that conversation with the person on the other side, for them to reveal something vulnerable about themselves. And I think that's still hard for many people because, you're in sales, you're supposed to be the expert. And you don't want people reluctant to get that at that personal level. And it's risky, right? I mean, this vulnerability is risky, and you talk about the risk a lot in the book about taking the step to disrupt yourself is a risk.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so there's something that if we can, I just want to touch on, because I'm having a curiosity, because I think that there's So sometimes I think when we think about vulnerability, it's like revealing to you, for example, hey, I want to do, like when I went to this manager and said, hey, I'd like to go into management at some point. And that felt very vulnerable to me, but it wasn't actually useful. And in that particular situation. So I think what I'm hearing you say, and I think a productive kind of vulnerability is more of, hey, I think you, my client, are trying to get X done, or hey, I think you, my boss, are trying to get X done or Y done. And I think I can help you solve it. And here's what it would look like. I don't know everything, but here's some of what I'm thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Are you willing to run this experiment? So there's a vulnerability in terms of not around your identity or your sense of self, but just a willingness to say, I don't have it all figured out, but I think I can figure out, and I think we can do it together, and I want to figure it out in your behalf. So that's how I'm thinking about it in this context.
Yeah.
Is that where your head's going?
Yeah, I mean, it's a willingness to be wrong.
Okay.
Right?
Got it.
That's basically what you're saying. Yeah, if I lay out this experiment, so I don't know if you know Charlie Green, who writes about trust and was one of the co-authors on the original Trusted Advisor. He calls it bring a risky gift, right, to a conversation.
I love that.
I may just be speculating here,
mm-hmm.
but let me lay this out, right? And you could just be completely wrong, but that's okay. You've engaged in the conversation, but you have to take a risk to put yourself in that position, and that's vulnerability.
So yep, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
But one of the things I wanted to ask you though is why do you think it's perceived as a risk to invest in disrupting yourself? I mean, you talk about various types of risks in the book, but it's.
Why do I think it's perceived as a risk? Okay, yeah, I have two answers for you on that. Well, maybe one answer, but it's sort of a couple of thoughts.
It gets to sort of this idea of the functional emotional rewards, which I want to get into as well. But go ahead.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So I want everybody again to picture some graph paper, and your life is on this grid of graphs. And basically, if you think about from your life right now today, let's call it you're at a 12 on the graph paper of life, and you're going over one, up one, over one, up one. So it's basically the trajectory that you're currently on, whatever that is. When you choose to disrupt yourself, you are making the decision that, yes, I'm on a 12 on that y-axis of success, and I'm willing to sacrifice some of my stature, my prestige, my compensation, my standing, whatever it is, to go down to a 10, to have people say to me, are you out of your mind? Because that's what it will look like. Because I believe, and I believe that when I do this, when I go down to that 10, my trajectory will stop being over one, up one, but it'll be over one, up two, or over one, up three. And the reason that you do that is you may say, well, I'm at a 12 and I'm getting these certain sort of functional rewards. I've got this particular salary, and I feel like I'm doing a pretty good job. But usually when you make that decision to disrupt yourself, there's a functional job that you're thinking, maybe in the future I can make more money, but almost always there's an emotional job that has been left undone that you feel like when you disrupt yourself, when you do that over one, up three, over one, up five, it will do both the functional and almost always, certainly, the emotional jobs better. And so in my case, when I left Wall Street, it was stupid. From a financial perspective, it was a very dumb decision. And, boss saying to me, you're going to regret this for the rest of your life. It was because that job was no longer doing the emotional job that I needed it to. So I had to disrupt myself so I could find a profession, a vocation that would allow me to do both the functional and the emotional job. So you step back to slingshot forward.
Yeah, and I wanted to sort of bring this back in, try to put in. I want your feedback on this, see if I'm off base or not. Here's my risky gift I'm bringing. I love that. So you talk about.
I accept your risky gift.
Okay. Well, I haven't said it yet. You may not. So when you talk about the jobs to be done theory, which I was fascinated by when I first read about it, and then you bring it up again, and made me think about it in the sales context because. And I guess Clayton Christensen popularized it. You said, and you gave an example of yourself as, there's always a functional and emotional component to it. As an investor, you hired an investment to do the job of making money, the functional job of making money, meaning when you invested money in something, you're hiring it to do that job, but you're also hiring it to do an emotional job for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking about in sales is that the buyer, the customer, is hiring the seller to do the functional job of helping them make a good decision.
Mm-hmm.
And that the emotional component, the emotional job they're hiring them to do is to make a decision that they perceive to be less risky, but also that will achieve certain outcomes for them as a business.
I would actually argue that's the functional job. So the functional job is we have certain things that we want to get done in our business. That's the functional job. The emotional job is what you said first, which is you're going to make me feel safer in making this decision because I don't have the expertise to do it. So you're going to sort of hold my hand, help walk me through it as we're trying to implement it. When I feel like I don't know what I'm going to do, how to do it, I'll be able to call you and rely on you. I trust you to help me in this process of change that I'm making by buying your product to help make my business better, that you will be there for me emotionally to figure this out when I don't know how to figure it out. So that's how I would think about it, sort of the functional versus emotional piece. What do you think when you hear that?
Well, I was just thinking about, from a buyer's perspective, they look at it as they've got a job to be done to make a decision, right? Mm-hmm. And going into it, they really don't know. They know they've got a problem, but maybe they don't know the scope of the problem. They certainly haven't defined the options that exist to be able to solve it. And they need sellers to help them go through that process to arrive to make a good decision. So I sort of looked at that as the functional part of it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Got it. So you're backing way up, right? To even figuring out what the solution is. Okay. Yeah. Agreed.
Well, but that's an interesting point because I think that most sellers don't pay attention to that part of the job the buyer is trying to accomplish. They just focus on, I'm engaging with the buyer who obviously they know what they really need to do. So I'm just competing on the basis of whether I'm going to be selected as the vendor or not. Mm-hmm. Which, that's that's a whole different job, right? But it's the end of the process. Whereas I think it really is functional to help them because they need you. They need you. That's what they're talking to you as a salesperson. If they could do it without you, they'd do it without you.
Yeah. We always would.
Yeah. So then, but the emotional component is, I think, to your point is, can you then, as a company, help them achieve the outcomes that were promised in the sales process?
Right. And going back to your part about making the decision in the first place is, can I trust you to help me think through this? And maybe even as I think through this, if we realize that you actually don't have the solution that I need, can I trust you to tell me that I should find the solution somewhere else, right? I think that's the whole emotional piece as well.
Yeah, that's even better. Yeah, that's good. All right, so I'm not completely crazy. I was sort of there, but I think this is it's a topic I want to explore some more with sellers because I think it's a great framework for people to think about what it is they're actually trying to do when they engage with a customer, and what's the customer looking to get out of it. Because I think when a buyer agrees to spend or invest some of their time with a seller, they're basically hiring them to do a job,
right?
And most sellers don't tend to think of it that way, but you're being hired to do a job.
And they're hiring the product to do a job. That's what's interesting.
That too, as well, right? Yeah,
you're hiring the product to do a job.
What's that? It's almost two different sets of hiring, right? One is you, because you as a seller are the sort of exemplification of the product in the company initially until they actually start implementing it.
Yeah, they're hiring you, the salesperson, and they're hiring the product, absolutely, to do both a functional and an emotional job. And as you're starting to tease that out, if you can almost have this grid and look at, okay, so what functional job are they hiring the product to do? What emotional job? What functional job are they hiring me to do? What emotional job? And when you can start to tease those out, it makes it a lot easier to make a sale because you're able to really understand what it is they're trying to buy. And if you can even sell it to them or if they need to go somewhere else.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know. We may have to collaborate on something on that. Because I think this is something as I read the book, I was like, okay, we explain this. This would make a lot of sense for sellers to help them make sense of really what they're supposed to be focused on, which is a problem. So, all right. We're sort of running out of time, but I got so much I want to talk about. Well, I think one of the things
that's a good problem.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the topics maybe we can tackle before we go to the end, I thought was interesting in the book as well is this whole idea of embracing constraints. And you're thinking about your disruption, but the fact is that understanding there are constraints as you grow and in the field that you're in is you said, is actually liberating in many respects. And I just want to dig into that a bit, because I sort of immediately, my mind gravitated to, it's going to sound completely off track, but gravitated to poetry.
It doesn't sound off track at all. Go ahead. Right? Say the example, because it's powerful. Yeah, please.
Right. Well, there are various forms of poetry, right? I mean, it could be the iambic pentameter, the meter that you use. It could be the structure, the type of poem you're writing. They have constraints, right? There's so many syllables per line, or rhyming patterns, or it's a sonnet with 13 lines. All that stuff is this amazing creativity flows out of the constraints.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you would mention that. So a year or two ago, we had Orson Scott Card on our podcast, who wrote the book Ender's Game, which is one of my favorite books of all time. And he actually used that exact example of what you just said, is that he said when he was in high school, his English teacher pulled him aside and said, this was the 60s and 70s. He said, you can keep writing this gushy whatever poetry that you want. But if you want to truly become a great writer, you need to learn how to write sonnets. So you need to start writing sonnets. And he said, basically, he credits his ability to write with that discipline of learning to write sonnets. So the bigger principle of this that you're touching on is this notion, if you think about science, is that in order for anything to move forward, there has to be friction, there has to be something to bump up against. And one of the things that we tend to do is to say, well, if only I had more time, or if I had a bigger budget, or I had more expertise, or I had more buy-in from my stakeholders, then I could be really effective at whatever it is I'm trying to do, in this particular instance, sales. But we know from the research, we know from the science that in fact, it's constraints that allow us to move up our S-curve of learning. I'll give you just one quick example as you're thinking about this. Is there was a post-mortem of 200 failed startups, and they divided them into the funded startups and the unfunded startups. And the number one reason that the funded startups, the ones that have been able to raise outside capital, had plenty of money on hand, the number one reason that they went out of business was that they ran out of cash. And it was only the number 10 reason for the unfunded startups. And so one of the things that I'm really advocating for is this notion that as you're trying to climb an S-curve, your constraints, whatever they are, and you're going to have them because you always do, is how do you turn those constraints not just into a victim of like, why me, and not even neutralize them, but how can those constraints be transformative for you? And one of the things I think is so exciting, and why what's happening in the world right now, is that Clayton Christensen said that the Great Recession, and I think it's also true for any sort of major upheaval, would have an unmitigated positive impact on innovation, because when tension is the greatest, we're most willing to rethink how we're doing business. And so for everybody who is listening to you, all of your audience, I would actually ask the question, if you think about some of your greatest successes in sales, it undoubtedly they were brought to you because there was some constraint, which may include a failure, because a failure is a constraint. There was some constraint in place that caused you to become better than you ever thought possible, because you were trying to figure out how to create something out of that constraint.
And I think it gets back to one of the topics I was bringing up earlier, is how do you sort of motivate people to to invest in themselves? Is one of the Gallup does surveys of salespeople and employees and so on, and the number one reason, I think, is roughly 60% of sellers said that they left a job is because of their manager. They weren't getting what they needed from their manager. And to me, it's like, well, that's a constraint, right? It's like, you're looking at them as a limit on your ability to improve. What are you doing? So operate within that constraint. What are the steps you're taking? You yourself, how are you investing in yourself? Are you turning off the TV and start watching a repeat of The Bachelor or whatever? Read a book or do something. And I think this is what really, for me, a lot of it sort of boiled down to that is, this not getting maybe the support you want isn't disabling. It's actually enabling for you if you look at it the right way, that this now says, okay, given these constraints, how do I get better?
Right. And what information is it giving you? And one of the questions that we'll ask in our coaching is, in this situation where you've got a boss that seems to be a blocker, what percentage of this is about your boss? What percentage of this is about you? And what percentage of this is about the system?
Mm-hmm.
And it would take pretty much a very, very narcissistic person to say none of it is about you, right? And so when you do that, you start to open the door of saying, okay, so I've got this constraint and I understand that there's this block, but what oftentimes basically is just saying there's something for you to learn. What is it that you can learn? You're in a room game. How are you going to get out of that room game? So I think that that's really interesting and powerful, just to say, well, if your boss is the constraint, then like you said, what are you going to create out of that? And what is there for you to learn? Because inevitably there is something for you to learn about yourself and how to become more effective.
Well, I think selling in general is sort of a game of constraints, right? I mean, you go to talk to a prospect.
I love that. Yes. Yes.
There's constraints. Can I talk to your boss? Well, no. All right. Well, how are we going to make that happen? Right. Or this is what we do. Well, that costs too much. Right. I mean, it's a game of constraints you have to deal with at all times. And I think the people who are generally more successful are those who embrace that ambiguity that comes with the constraints and say, oh, what can I do with this situation?
You're probably one of those people that loves the word no, right? No is just the starting point for you, isn't it?
Well, I was telling this story yesterday with somebody. I had a boss who came up to me once. I was VP of sales for this company, and boss comes up to me and says, it's a question for you. He says, don't you ever just say yes to anything? And I said, no. Because every time there was a suggestion, I do it this way, do it that way. It's like, let me think about that, right? Is that because then you're putting constraints on me because you want me to go do this, but what's the best way that I could get it done? So
Oh, that's interesting. So wait a second. So you're telling me, I was saying that when people say no to you, you're like, okay, that's a constraint. How am I going to get around that? But you're also telling me that you're really comfortable saying, no, let me think about that because maybe there's a different way to do it. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So you like it in both instances. You're willing to say no, but you also like the no.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
There's something to that. I hope that you really double click on that, because that to me is a secret of a person who's a great salesperson.
Well, that's the point I was trying to make is that I was fortunate enough early in my career to have bosses that gave me leeway, right? I was trained in a methodology, I was trained in a process, and I had my own sort of unique personality. I was a real introvert coming out of school and starting sales. Still, I'm an introvert. But it's like, the way they want me to do this, just either have to quit or I got to find a way to do it that aligns with how I feel comfortable working, which I did. And they didn't care because ultimately I was, delivering big numbers.
You're selling.
Right.
You're doing your job.
But right now we've entered this phase because of I think because there's so many managers that have been rapidly promoted without achieving the mastery at sales that they need, is they're not comfortable letting salespeople become this best version of themselves because it's perceived to be too risky. I'll put trust in the metrics I can look at, but I don't want you to vary from what we're doing. And so selling's become more compliance-based in many respects. And this is, one of the things I keep advocating is now give people the room to discover, themselves in that regard.
Oh, that's interesting. So if people were getting promoted too quickly because they're not able to sort of understand what to do enough that they can break the rules, is becoming more prescriptive, which is hindering the whole process.
Because it's perceived as less risky. Because if we've got a process that's prescriptive and I follow the process, if my sellers aren't making it, well, it's not really a reflection of me. I followed the process.
Interesting.
Well, it's good. Well, unfortunately, we got to jump to another interview here before too long, but it's been so much fun talking with you. Would love to have you back sometime and do it again.
I would love that. This has been a blast. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, and if people want to contact you or connect with you, how can they do that?
I think the easiest way is, if you're interested in these ideas, would be to listen to one of our podcast episodes. If you just go to whitneyjohnson.com, or you can go find it anywhere, but it's Disrupt Yourself. And I would direct people to episode 100 of the podcast, which is all about taking the right kinds of risks, and episode 120, which is about playing to your distinctive strengths, if you want to just drill down on these ideas a little bit more.
Oh, perfect. Oh, good. Well, Whitney, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Andy.
Okay, friends, that's it for today's episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. So grateful for your support of this show. And I want to thank my guest, Whitney Johnson, for sharing her insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you could also leave us a rating or review and let us know how we're doing, we'd really appreciate it. And you can do all that on your phone in less than a minute as soon as this podcast is over. So thanks for your help. And thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone. RingDNA is the leading sales enablement platform that uses AI to help scale business growth. Trusted by the top companies across the globe, RingDNA offers a suite of powerful tools for every sales role. The RingDNA Dialer radically improves sales productivity and call connection rates, while guided selling helps reps know exactly what to do and when to do it. Conversation AI uses artificial intelligence to surface the most impactful coaching opportunities in real time. So, no matter where your team is working from, the RingDNA platform can help them exponentially increase call connections, opportunities, and revenue. Learn more at ringdna.com/platform. That's ringdna.com/platform.